Our fifth and final speaker is Irina Isakova, and she's with Carbon Limits in Norway, and she's going to give us a presentation on reducing emissions from the oil and gas sector, lessons learned from the last decade.
Hi, everyone. And first of all, thanks a lot for being able to participate in this event and to present the lessons learned by Carbon Limits, working in the oil and gas sector over the last many years, but today I'll focus on the lessons learned over the last decade. My name is Irina, and I've been with Carbon Limits over the last 7 years, watching the changes happening, the ones I'm going to be talking about. Our company is a climate consultancy based in Norway, and we focus on climate mitigation with a specific focus on the oil and gas sector. So, like the other speakers, would like to start with the key takeaways first and come back to them throughout my presentation. First of all, from what we observe, there is important progress that is happening already in the oil and gas sector when it comes to short-lived climate pollutants, in particular methane, wet carbon, particulate matter, and so on. Many of the sources are being addressed, many of the sources of emissions are being addressed, but we see very drastic changes and differences between the different regions and countries. This is something that Lena has also been presenting in her previous presentation. At the same time, we see new technologies for emissions monitoring, and here in particular, I'm thinking of methane, emerging and available to the stakeholders, and access to this data can enable better decision making. So there is more information available to plan and strategize and develop mitigation plans which allow companies and countries to act quickly. But at the same time, this needs to be coupled with more capacity building, because the level of knowledge and understanding of these technologies is different across different regions. And also, as Lena said, more focus on policy implementation, and I'll come back to that. And finally, again, maybe more on the methane side, the issues of methane emission in the oil and gas sector is quite complex. There are multiple sources. They are not visible to the naked eye. There is many research papers coming out weekly, I would say, on this topic, many new technologies being available for monitoring and mitigation, which makes it complicated for operators in certain regions to follow these discussions and to be able to prioritize them. So I would like to start with one large category of emission sources in the oil and gas sector, which is flaring, which I'm sure all of us are very familiar with. Flaring, emissions from flaring of associated petroleum and gas, APG, have been around for the longest time and have been in focus for many years now. Unfortunately, as you see from the graph, the last decade has been called a decade of stalled progress on flaring, because this black line that you see here, it's stabilized after reducing. And what you see here is not the overall emissions from flaring, but rather flare intensity, which means amount of gas APG flared divided by the amount of oil and gas produced in the different countries. So we see that flare intensity has flattened out, we can say, but it doesn't mean that certain countries have not done a lot to reduce their emissions. Actually, there are quite a few success stories across different regions, and here you have a few examples of US, Canada, and Colombia being able to drastically reduce their flaring intensity from their oil and gas operations. We are talking about 50 to 70% reduction over the last 10 years. They have a few, they have a few common traits for the success stories that we're observing. All of the countries managed to have strictly enforced regulations, and here we're not only talking about strict regulations, but also following up on these regulations being enforced properly, which often means having enough administrative capacity and resources to follow this up, and also having some penalties for non-compliance with the regulations. In addition, a common trait for these countries is that they have a domestic gas market that incentivizes associated gas recovery. And this can manifest itself in many different forms, but for example, associated gas can have preferential access when it reaches the transmission gas pipeline, or it can mean good market conditions in terms of price for this gas and good remuneration to the operators that actually recover the gas. So seeing both the success stories, but also the stalled progress across other countries, we think that there is still quite a bit of work remaining to be done on addressing flaring. So one of the items on the to-do on the next steps is to continue focus and pressure by the international capital markets and consumers to address emissions from the oil and gas sector. We are already seeing this now. We are seeing that the buyers of oil and gas products, as well as investors in these industries, they're increasingly looking for better reporting and better action planning from the oil and gas sector. And we believe that it is important to continue to put this pressure onto the oil and gas sector to reduce further their emissions. And if they cannot be reduced immediately, then to have an actionable plan on how they're planning to do this in the future. Another step that we see very important is to focus on enforcement of already existing regulations. Many countries have in place quite strict regulations when it comes to flaring. Many ban flaring, so routine flaring, as part of normal operations. Many have high fees for flaring or for emissions that are produced as a result of flaring. Yet we see that they're not properly enforced everywhere. So focusing on making sure that there is sufficient administrative resources and also the punishment for non-compliance in place should ensure that the existing regulations will be enacted and will lead to the results that we're expecting. And then finally, focusing on financing barriers for gas flare utilization can also be one of the next steps. Many of the large flares have already been addressed. So many of the flares that we are observing now are of medium and small scale. There are still large flares remaining as well, but many are of smaller scale, which makes the economics of these projects quite challenging because in order to utilize APG, you need large investments in gas processing infrastructure and also sometimes gas transportation infrastructure in order to bring the gas to the market. So it requires large upfront capex, which the companies do not always have the means to finance. And this is again echoing what Lena has been talking about. Maybe some more profitable ventures are prioritized over this climate mitigation measures in competition for resources and investments. So this was covering our experience related to flaring, and the other large share of emissions coming from the oil and gas sector, especially short-lived climate pollutants, are direct releases of methane. And here we are not talking about combustion of methane, we are talking about direct releases into the atmosphere, sometimes called fugitive emissions, sometimes called leaks and vents, basically everything that is directly released into the atmosphere without combustion. And from our experience, what we knew 10 years ago is still true today. So 10 years ago, there were already mature technologies for mitigation of methane emissions, and they remain to be valid, they remain to be feasible and available today. We also know that many of the abatement options for methane emissions in the oil and gas sector, they require much smaller capital investment than, for example, gas utilization infrastructure, which makes them much more economically viable options for the oil and gas sector. And Lena said as well, methane emissions in the oil and gas sector is some of the most lucrative mitigation opportunities for methane across all sectors that are meeting this greenhouse gas. And what we also knew and are still confirming now is that the emission estimates from the oil and gas sector are highly uncertain. So a few things we've learned of the last decade, and one of the big things that has emerged is a number of quantitative technologies, monitoring technologies that have become available. Just like for monitoring of flaring, we now can monitor methane with satellites from space. I'm sure you have seen over the last years many news articles related to leaks and vents that have been observed from space. This is important because remote monitoring allows us to make some new conclusions about the nature of emissions, methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. And what we are seeing is that there is high variability in emissions from the oil and gas sector. Not all sites are alike. Here is an example of one of the regions that we've explored, but this is true for regions across the world. We are seeing that a small number of sites are responsible for a large amount of methane emissions. Here, 3% of the sites are responsible for over 60% of emissions. And this is important because if we are able to see where these 3% of the sites are and develop mitigation plans to address emissions from this 3% of the sites, then we have a large share of the problem solved, over 60% of the emissions solved for this specific case, of course. And we are seeing that many of the companies and governments are also finally putting methane in focus. We are seeing that many companies are purchasing equipment and data that allow them to do leak detection and repair and DAR. This is a process to not only identify leaks on the facilities and mitigate them straight away or during next maintenance, but also to map out other sources of methane emissions and plan how companies can mitigate them in the future. In addition, many companies have joined international initiatives related to methane emissions in the oil and gas sector, and here are a few. These initiatives are central to making sure that there is available information, that there is transparency related to methane emissions, and that there is mitigation being planned. And finally, on the government level, the methane emissions are being addressed through regulation. We are seeing a few successful examples of not only implementing regulation, but actually already enforcing it. So on the way for methane, we also believe that we need to accelerate action. We see successful examples of mitigation happening both on the company level and on regulatory level on the country level, but we need to act quickly. So we have 85 months left before 2030, and in order to achieve 1.5 degree target that we're all aiming for, methane emissions should be reduced by 40 to 45%. And oil and gas sector, as Lena mentioned before, is the only sector where the majority of the methane emissions can be reduced cost effectively. This means that we can mitigate most of our methane emissions globally through oil and gas sector, and we have to do this quickly. I want to conclude by saying that the actions need to be global. There are regional and country examples of successful actions on this already, but it's not enough that one or two countries lead the way. We need all of the major oil and gas producing countries to do their bit in order to mitigate methane emissions. Thank you for your time.